Globalization is a multi-layered fabric. It's not just trade, it's investment, it's movement of ideas, movement of people, business relationships, cultural relationships. Part of the issue is we've moved from a unipolar to a multipolar world, and the institutions haven't adapted. It's a shift in how confrontational and short-sighted and self-dealing the U.S. is, and it's a shift to backing national champions in a very direct way. The U.S. basically has said it's going from being commissioner of baseball to being owner of one of the teams. And if you're owner of one of the teams, everybody benefits when you lose. We end up with a weak commissioner or no commissioner. Eventually, the U.S. has nobody to play with.
You've written about the Chinese economy. Has it peaked?
I think the growth rate's definitely peaked. Has the economy as a whole peaked, either in the sense of being a tech leader or its relative size versus the rest of the world? No. China creates the AIIB, the new BRICS Bank, but none of these will be institutions worth the name. The non-China, non-US rest of the world, and the EU would have to play a leading role, is occasionally whacking the US upside the head and saying, no, we're going to go ahead with a constructive globalization, even if you're not.
The economic costs of a geopolitical adventurism become too high, you'll probably see the balance shift back.
India, because of its size, because of its demographic profile, because of its military and foreign policy role, has a potential to play beyond what even Indonesia and Brazil has. And of course, India is more central than anybody else, is incredibly important in geopolitical terms.
Is my emphasis on technology as the key driver overstated?
Your book is deservedly influential, and your title, of course, the title of the podcast, Great Tech Game, is apt. The emphasis on technology is right. In the end, the only source of long-going, sustainable productivity growth is technological progress and technological adoption of the new ideas.
Welcome to today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, where we bring you smart, insightful, big picture conversations at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, geoeconomics, history, and much more. And today I'm delighted to have with us Adam Posen, who's the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, based in Washington, D.C. Adam's writings on the big picture stories around economics, trade, macroeconomics is something I've been following for some time. So I'm delighted to have with us today Adam Posen. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you so much, Anirudh. I really appreciate it. And your podcast has some amazing conversations. I'll try to live up to it.
No, I'm sure you will. We're excited to have you with us on the podcast today. What I'm hoping to do over the course of the next hour or so with you, Adam, is to go big picture on the global economic order that we're living through. Much of our conversations over the last few episodes have focused on the geopolitics of our world, how the changing geopolitics is shaping the relations between nations. But today I really want to draw upon your expertise to draw out for our listeners the big picture of the changes underway in the global economic order. That's one. Second, we'll try and discuss the relationship between technology and economic growth today. And also obviously discuss the emerging topic of generative AI and what that might mean for economic growth across nations. And thirdly, we'll try and get into some country-specific conversations around, of course, the U.S, China, but also other large economies around the world. And so to get us started, I want to ask you first a basic question, but a big picture one, which is, talk to us about your economic worldview. What, in your mind, when you think of the economic world order, what are some of the things that you tend to think of that help shape your understanding of the economic order? And then we'll get into the changes that seem to be underway. But draw out for us the worldview you have of what determines an economic world order.
Thank you so much. So I would emphasize four themes. The first is what I've referred to and written about called the corrosion of globalization. That's to say that it's not just globalization ended, there's one decision, US does this, China does that, but that globalization is a multi layered fabric. It's not just trade, it's investment, it's movement of ideas, movement of people, business relationships, cultural relationships. And because of US China tensions and US more general withdrawal from globalization, it's been fraying. There are some layers that are spreading apart, some places where there are holes in the fabric, but in other places it continues to spread. In Southeast Asia in particular, we see greater integration. We may see greater integration in Eastern Europe. And importantly, trade turns out to be far more resilient than people thought, but that some other things like investment and technological standards are going to prove and already are proving much less resilient. The second point I would raise is the segmentation of the world economy. People talk about blocks, but the tendency to think in terms of blocks is, I think, a little misleading. It's basically right, but I think the two ways in which it's misleading is it too much thinks there's a mapping directly onto national security, and it underemphasizes the importance of a lot of players who are not US, China, EU. So, in particular, I think what we could call third nations, the largest emerging markets, India, obviously, but Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, if it gets its economic act together, matter a great deal. And obviously, the UAE and Saudi matter a great deal. And that while these are not constructive or global players the way the US once was, their actions do matter. But additionally, small economies, notably in Asia, Singapore, Korea, Japan is not small, and Australia have influences as well. So I think this tendency of the world to segment is important. And part of that, sadly, is my belief that once you get beyond the largest emerging markets, most of the low income economies are doing very poorly and will unfortunately continue to do so, in part because globalization's opportunities are eroded. The third point is that for the large economies, the G7, meaning US, Japan, the major economies in Europe, and some others, mainstream so-called neoliberal macroeconomics still holds. The fact that inflation went up and came down and was brought down reflects things like the Phillips curve works, reflects things like central bank independence works, reflects things like fiscal policy is effective both for good and for bad. And so our basic understanding of dealing with the fluctuations, let's call it, in the major economies is actually pretty sound. It's unsatisfying. There are a lot of people politically who are very unhappy with the outcomes you get. And Paul Krugman famously, I think 30 years ago, talked about the age of diminished expectations. Instead, we're now in an age of gapping expectations between expectations and reality. But our understanding and what central banks do and what budget policy does for good and for ill is still very valid. The final big picture theme I would talk about bridges into something I know you talk about a lot on this podcast, as well as your more recent focus on geopolitics, which is technology. And to sound trite, in the end, the only source of long-going sustainable productivity growth is technological progress and technological adoption of the new ideas. And that's going to be true for dealing with climate as well. So there, it's pretty boring for me to say, but that to me is the other big component.
No, great. Those are four, I think, very big picture themes that I think over the course of now the next hour we'll dig deeper into. Let's talk about the first one, which is the corrosion of globalization, right? As you are seeing it across the different dimensions you've mentioned, right? The movement of capital, people, ideas, goods, services. What's going on, according to you? Is this corrosion of globalization related largely to the inequality that the 30, 40 years of the international economic order as the neoliberal order we've seen it, that has engendered? Is the corrosion largely a reaction to that? Or is the corrosion of globalization also being driven by the geopolitics of our time, where clearly the tensions between the US and China, US's primary geopolitical competitor today, is driving this kind of segmentation that you were also talking about? Or is there something else also going on? What's driving this corrosion? And what's the future? Are we expecting a new international order to emerge or just globalization to modify in some ways?
Really good question, and showing your Carnegie Endowment roots. I think the important point to make is I don't believe there's a quick mapping from inequality to global anti-globalization. There is that narrative. A lot of people would like to tell that narrative. Some people sincerely believe it, but it just doesn't fit the facts. What instead is going on is partly the geopolitical tensions you mentioned, and I'll come back to that. But also, I think genuinely there's been an ideological shift, despite many people, including in the Biden administration and also in the Trump administration, talking about, oh, we went too far with globalization, or we had hyper globalization, or we ignored national security, all these things. It was fundamentally an ideological value shift because, as I argued in a piece in Foreign Affairs a few years ago called The Price of Nostalgia, and we have data on this on the Peterson Institute website, the US started withdrawing from globalization, depending on which measure you look at, in the late 90s or early 2000s. So we stopped doing trade deals very early in the 2000s, that we sort of eked out this Korea deal that we then subverted. And obviously, USMCA was less liberal, less integrating, less fair to Mexico than NAFTA was. We put up more restrictions on foreign direct investment, and we became less hospitable to it. The share of foreign direct investment each year in US GDP has been declining. We've been cutting back on migration, notwithstanding the welcome surge the last couple of years. I shouldn't say surge, people get upset, but anyway, the welcome increase over the last years. But basically, immigration's been declining for 25 or 30 years in the US. On and on down the list. And this all happened before the inequality started. And then the whole timing, the China shock, when people talk about the China shock, which I know you've done on this program, it doesn't map, because the communities that were hurt by it were not necessarily that decisive in the elections. And more importantly, as much as these communities hurt, they were really small compared to the whole economy. I mean, let's not forget, the US workforce now is between 160 and 170 million people. The best estimate of the so-called China shock by Otter, Dorn, and Hansen is 2 million people lost manufacturing jobs over 15 years. So that's, less than 100,000 a year. No, excuse me, it's 120,000 a year. And that's in a workforce of what was then 150 million people. So it was 1/10 of 1%. And again, that doesn't mean these human beings don't matter and we shouldn't have responded to them. But the idea that when there's millions of people every year leaving jobs, forced to leave jobs, laid off, choosing to leave jobs, moving, average churn in the US economy is 40 to 60 million people a year, even leaving out the COVID mess. And the idea that our whole stance on economic policy and foreign policy was driven by what happened to, 100,000 people a year, which is a tiny fraction of the total number of people losing their jobs, even the total number of people involuntarily losing their jobs, just doesn't make any sense. I view it as it's part and parcel with the same sort of nationalism, reactionary forces, anger, because I think, the so-called elite, the blob, has messed up. We didn't do well initially with the financial crisis, and we partly caused it. I say we, I'm not really part of it, but people think I am, so anyway. By deregulation, which I oppose, but financial deregulation and supervision caused the financial crisis and responsible for that. COVID, it's not clear how much better we could have done, but still it was very disappointing, huge shock to people. Foreign policy, we spent 20 years sending off American people to be killed and killing lots of other people in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, there's a list of failures that I can understand why people are angry, but I don't view it as inequality. But then there's the geopolitics, which, as you said, is first and foremost. And I think these interact, that when you get into a security threat mindset, the so-called security dilemma, and you see an enemy like China, as it's perceived, that then tends to make you think differently about economics. You move from thinking about it as a positive something interacting between households and businesses to a zero something interacting between nations.
No, absolutely. And I want to dig into the geopolitics piece obviously a little bit more in a second. But, I was having a recent conversation with Gary Gerson. I don't know if you're familiar with his book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order.
Yeah.
When you were outlining the four big themes, right, just now, when we started off our conversation, I expected that one of the themes there would be, and if there's a fifth I could propose to you to maybe dig deeper on, is the role of the state versus the market, right? So one of Gary's, I think, main theses in his recent book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, but also in his earlier book, I think from 30 odd years ago, 40 odd years ago, which is about the New Deal order, is that in the US we've seen the pendulum swing from, and this links back to the point you made about the elites, right? Having acted irresponsibly. His argument is that we've shifted from an era under the New Deal order where the state had a much stronger, clearer role in the economy during the 1930 to broadly the 1970 to 1980 period. Whereas from 1980s onwards till today, his view is that the market forces really gained prominence, the role of the government in the economy went down, and the last 30, 40 years as a result maybe created the conditions for the elites to do, as you said, maybe the economic elites also, to maybe get carried away and do things that the rest of the economy or the rest of the population didn't appreciate. As a result of which, he's saying that today we are seeing this neoliberal order maybe start to fray, right? So I want to get your views on that. To what extent do you feel the role of the state might now, in the revised economic order that we might be on, on the in the beginning stages of, how do you expect the role of the state to change? Do you expect more industrial policies, as is evident from the very recent announcement that, of course, President Biden has made on higher tariffs as well? Of course, there's the IRA. There's a lot of talk about industrial policy around the world today. Do you expect the role of the state to now fundamentally change over the next 2-3 decades in the economy?
Wow. I think the idea of neoliberalism and is the state active or not is overdone. Not because it's not important, but because for all of Ronald Reagan's rhetoric or Margaret Thatcher's rhetoric, it's not very meaningful to think about a general sense of the state versus market. It's not like in China where President Xi very definitely came in and started talking around 2015, a couple of years after he consolidated power, explicitly about rebalancing the state versus the market. While Thatcher and Reagan talked about that, and others did later, and Clinton did, and Blair did their neoliberal bits. I'm sorry to keep invoking U.S. and U.K., but I mean, it was a general thing. I don't think that reflected the reality. So there was a reality, as I already said, and I know you've discussed, that the U.S. became completely irresponsible on financial regulation and supervision in the 90s. But I think that was specific to that industry. If you look at a whole bunch of other things, the pace of deregulation, of liberalization had slowed. There were industries where there were special interests, frankly, controlling a very strong state role and capturing things, and they kept it. So I'm not, and then right now the issue, and sometimes it gets dressed up this way by Biden administration officials, but the issue with industrial policy isn't that the government's in, because right now the way they've set up the industrial policy, as I've written about in Foreign Policy Magazine, is picking national champions and basically giving handouts to companies, which is not the state coming in a good way. I mean, there's a little bit that they're enforcing worker rights better for some of the companies who get grants. Okay. But, we've had under Trump, but also under Biden, very poor enforcement. In Trump's case, deliberately, in Biden's case, reluctantly, but very poor enforcement of a lot of laws that are on the books. So my colleague at Peterson, who teaches at MIT Sloan School, Anna Stansbury, just had a recent piece out about how For example, minimum wage laws and worker protections just don't get enforced, and there's very little penalties. And if a worker complains, they get retaliated against, and there's almost no recourse. And then you look at environmental stuff. So, sorry to rant. It's not I'm opposed to having an active state. I would like it in a lot of ways. I would like a much more activist fiscal policy tied to the business cycle in automatic ways, a much bigger state sector in the US than we currently have. It's just that I don't think it's the right way to look at the package. Again, I understand why people do that. It fits certain political science categories. It fits rhetoric that got a lot of attention, but it's not an accurate portrayal of what really happened.
So if I was to try and summarize, if I've understood this correctly, you're saying the state's role should be more focused on enforcement of the laws and the rules of the game in many ways, and not so much on picking national champions, as it seems
Well,
to be more
I'm in
recently from.
favor. I'm in favor of a lot of state spending on R&D. I'm in favor of a lot of
Yeah.
state spending on infrastructure. I'm in favor of a lot of more rules in some areas. My main point, though, is if you want to look at the U.S. right now, I think one of the things that is very unfortunate, and it's partly due to the way our courts have been packed with extremist conservative judges, is that enforcement is terrible. And if you're not going to enforce the laws you have on the books, then what's the point of passing a bunch more laws?
Yeah. And so on that national champion piece, right, which seemingly, like if you look at the IRA, you look at the semiconductor fab, money that's going to a few select companies, some of course American, some non-American. One of the things that's been spoken about, and this is now a view from the rest of the world, if I may offer that to you for your input, is 20, 30 years ago when China comes into the WTO, the expectation clearly that time was that by bringing China into the world trade system, by bringing China into this economic globalization model that the US had championed, the China system, economic and political, would become more like the US. But now, 20 years later, some people are saying that actually what's happening is that the Americans are trying to become more like the Chinese in terms of picking national champions, of the kind of state intervention that many people from outside are seeing a much larger role of the American state, American government in the economy. What's your sense? Is that kind of perception correct?
I think there's more nationalism. But if you go back to the way the U.S. negotiated with other countries and some of the rhetoric following before and after 9/11, I mean, leave aside the geopolitics, just on the economics, right? You had people complaining the U.S. was imposing GMO foods on the rest of the world. The U.S. was imposing its standards on drugs, including much higher intellectual property protection on the rest of the world. The U.S. was imposing its standards on accounting, or at least that you had to recognize U.S. accounting standards. The U.S., there was a whole list going back 25 years where the U.S. government, under both Republicans and Democrats, was imposing a lot of stuff, imposing how the IMF acted, imposing how the World Bank acted.
It was the unipolar moment. So
Yeah, no, but so again, yes, I think there is a change now. The U.S. foreign policy, there used to be, and again, go back to the discredited elites or blob or whatever, there was a useful thing that there was a bunch of academics, senior officials, advisors, senior civil servants who saw rightly, in my view, the value of the rules-based economic system, the value of judicious, not excessive liberalization, which usually meant liberalization in other countries more than the US, and links between economics and foreign policy, and that this is all gone now. Now, is it gone for a long time? Is it gone for a short time? Is it gone forever? That's a topic which you raised and we should get to. But just to say that shift under both Trump and Biden is real. And so you're having this nationalist policy under the guise of national security or foreign policy for the middle class or all this other garbage. And it's a shift in how confrontational and short sighted and self dealing the US is. And it's a shift to backing national champions in a very direct way rather than through rules that are conducive perhaps to American advantage, but helping specific companies with specific investments. And it's an obsession with manufacturing that frankly, even the national security doesn't justify on this scale, and the economics certainly doesn't, which then gets turned into this obsession with place-based policies. And I think that's another key difference is that, and again, this is a place where maybe a situation where maybe the change is more justified, although I still don't buy it. But the idea that the so-called neoliberal policies tended to treat the US on a universalist basis, and for both electoral political reasons and human reasons, this was a mistake because it overlooked how there would be impacts in local places.
Yeah, how much place mattered, how much local mattered.
Yeah.
Job.
And I still think it's frankly unethical because you're basically then you start dividing the society and privileging people who refuse to move over people who are forced to adapt. And you're privileging small places over large places. And you have this horrid word heartland, which suggests that there's in nationalist terms, there's a part of the land and the people that are more important and purer and better than the other citizens. And so I view it as pernicious. But anyway, that's another part of the shift. And sorry, I'm going on too long, but you started with the thing about China. And there's no question, there were certain people, particularly non-economists in the foreign policy world, who had this aspirational view, and also CEOs who got caught up in, I have to have a presence in China, and wanted to talk their game, talk their book, talking all about, and this is going to change China. Most serious economists did not make that claim. What they made two claims. First, that over time, if China is integrated in the world economy, its wages will rise, its technological capacity will rise, and so its interests will become more like the US in commercial affairs. And that was happening for a while, and that got lost. And the economists were probably, myself included, were too confident of that, but it was a much more limited and reasonable claim. But the second point, which is still valid, is that where we get to run the experiment in reverse, is that China exists. China exists, and its human beings are allowed to make a living. And it has a certain comparative advantages, irrespective of IP theft or subsidies, that it has anyway, just because it exists, and it has a somewhat marketized economy. And under those circumstances, it was better to have China in the WTO in permanent normal trade relations with the US, where there were rules and there were constraints and there were transparency aspects, than having them on the outside just behaving willy-nilly.
And so, is your sense that the American economy is trying to be managed more like the Chinese economy now, or not?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, the Chinese economy is now moving even further in a statist direction. And as I said, I think there's a much more meaningful concept to think about Xi thought and his recent discussions of dual circulation, and there's a new phrase out there, new productive forces, is very deliberately an overall concept of state versus market. I think in the US, in parts of Western Europe or throughout Europe and Japan, there's been a shift. But again, I think it's not this top-down Gesamtkonzept, we would say in German, overall concept. It's more, we've got national security, we're concerned with that, we're concerned with geopolitics, we're concerned about losing a tech competition, and therefore we do boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, and one of the implications of that, right, that emphasis, overemphasis, as you're saying, on national security concerns, is this idea that's now floating around intellectually that for too long we've emphasized efficiency as a guiding principle for the global economic order. And now we've got to move into resilience as a key principle of the global economic order, which might mean, diversification of supply chains, much lower reliance on China in those supply chains, especially in certain sectors, small yard, high fence, things like that. What's your view on that? Like, as we think about the principles that will underlie the changes in the global economic order, we've discussed the role of the state, maybe role of industrial policy, and what your views on that are, your views on the trade. Tell me what you think of this almost like tug of war, as I'm seeing, between efficiency as a guiding principle and resilience as a guiding principle.
Again, I think I understand why the rhetoric is there, and there's something to be said for it, but I think of it mostly as an overdone rhetorical device. Um, there is no question that you can, supply chains grew up organically, right? It wasn't like somebody sat in Washington or Geneva or New York and said, efficiency is what matters. And suddenly you had global supply chains. What happened was you had a bunch of companies throughout the world, and on a CFO, on an earnings call, a CFO would say, we're going to cut expenses 15% this year. And with some lag, somebody 4 levels down running a plant in a particular place would say, oh God, I've got to cut 20%. And I know somebody in Turkey or in China or in Vietnam or Malaysia can get me this product. And then once they get that product from there, the next time they have to cut costs, so that person's business network, brother, subcontractor, whatever, says, well, hey, I can get you this. And it just grows up organically. And we saw this. That's what the efficiency is. Efficiency isn't some top-down concept. It's that it bubbles up. Individual businesses and managers and entrepreneurs are making decisions, and you end up with efficiency on average. And we saw this very definitely when COVID hit, because like at Peterson Institute, we were running around talking to a number of companies we work with who support us and we interact with, and saying to them, okay, can you help us? You don't need to disclose anything publicly, but we're trying to understand the supply chains. It became very clear that world-leading massive manufacturing companies didn't really understand their supply chains because it had been this completely decentralized organic thing. And so, of course, it makes sense at some level, especially at a public level, that you say, okay, there's an externality here. The government, the businesses are not together taking into account the social externalities if they're overly dependent on one supplier or one location. But that's not a sea change. That's an adjustment. That's people saying, okay, it's less efficient. Let's have a backup plant. Let's have plants in more than one place. It's less efficient, but it's not zero efficient. It's, let's invest some money in trying to figure out what our supply chains are and rationalizing them. And so again, I'm not fighting against this in any way. It's part of the give and take where the state gets involved, where events reveal things to businesses and they realize, hey, this is not right. It's like when Toyota had a particular plant that they depended on for all their parts in Japan for one particular part. I can't remember what part, but it was in the earthquake and tsunami zone in 2011. And it shut down. And then Toyota realized, okay, just-in-time inventory has its advantages, but we also got to have some backup.
No, of course, in many ways, though, the resilience camp is also the camp that is today prioritizing geopolitics over economics, right? The efficiency camp, broadly speaking, will be the camp that says, really here the economic efficiency matters. Sure, you want to diversify risk, but efficiency in a capitalist economic system is what really matters. So if we can recategorize these camps as two camps, one says economic trumps, geopolitics matters, but economic trumps. The other camp says geopolitics trumps, economics matters. My question for you is, clearly now, the current discourse seems to be where geopolitics is trumping economics. National security concerns seem to be trumping economics. What has to happen now for this kind of discourse to change back to economics trumping geopolitics or national security? What has to happen?
Look, there's the rational perspective and then there's the realistic perspective.
Yeah, give us both.
Yeah, the
rational
rational perspective is one has a conversation an ongoing series of conversations with responsible officials of the Biden administration, or if it's not Biden, Trump in the next administration, if such people exist, and you say, look, there's small fence, small yard, high fence, great image. In reality, what you've been doing is incredibly large yard with indeterminate fence, with the idea being you're saving money and political chits by not having to enforce on everything. But if you leave the fence boundaries very uncertain, people are scared, right? Because they're not sure, if literally it's a chip, but it's about 3 levels back, is a U.S. service provider going to be sanctioned because they're providing services to an input to somebody in China, right? So to the Biden administration under Jake Sullivan, it seems this is a feature, not a bug. And the goal would be to instead have a conversation, a debate, a discussion, and have the national security people genuinely set up a list. Yes, chips of certain size are national security important. Yes, we cannot be reliant on only one source for critical materials. Solar panels are probably not national security because they're fixed and nobody can take away the sun, and we don't use them to drop on the heads of invading Chinese armies, right? So you push towards a genuine small yard high fence, and you do that. But neither the Biden or the Trump people want to do that right now, and the national security people never want to be caught out with a specific list of what's national security critical, because then they feel limited and it gets worked around.
They feel fenced in.
Yeah, they don't want to be right. So anyway, that's the rationale. Realistically, I think what's going to happen is some combination of the following. I think if we play it right, which seems like it will be more likely under Biden 2 than under Trump 2, there is some actual give and take with major allies who are also major economies. So the EU, Japan, UK, Korea, figure out your list. Ideally also Mexico and Canada. And you have some give and take in which you trade off some of the US arbitrary power and overreach for greater conformity across the alliance of export controls, of investment screening, of integration. And you create some kind of mechanism that, yes, you may all be opposed to China doing things, but that there shouldn't be a constant bidding war between US, Japan, EU, UK, India over who's going to site which industrial base where, and bankrupting their respective taxpayers, just to end up in an arms race where everybody ends up with something below scale who then exploits them. And also some provision for getting technology out to the developing world rather than forcing them all to come begging to the US. So that to me is not certain, but that's attainable.
Yeah.
A second thing that I think is attainable is the non-China, non-US rest of the world, and the EU would have to play a leading role, but Japan, Australia, and others, and Singapore and South Korea can all play a role, is occasionally whacking the US upside the head and saying, we're going to go ahead with a constructive globalization, even if you're not. And so we're going to extend and deepen CPTPP, and that means you're going to lose relative market access, and you can decide whether you're going to live with that or not. We're going to have more openness, as EU seems to be deciding, to EVs from China. Maybe not unfettered openness, maybe not without some pushback at China on subsidies, but we're not going to deprive our consumers of the ability to buy green enhancing electric vehicles for a fraction of what they now cost. And then the US over time, and this is part of what I think the Peterson Institute role and your podcast role is to say, okay, here are the economic costs of what's going on. And these will become more and more evident over time, unless we get to productivity. We'll talk about that. Maybe they'll get hidden. But they arguably get more evident, and then you say, okay, national security supposedly trumps, fine. It's like Brexit, right? And everything I predicted and others predicted about the bad things happening in Brexit turned out to be right. Now, that doesn't mean that the people couldn't decide, well, national identity or anti immigrant or anti EU feeling in Brexit was more important than the economics. And similarly, US people can decide, bleep economics. I'm willing to pay a lot more for this. I'm willing to have fewer jobs. Fine.
Yeah.
They're entitled. But let's at least be clear about it.
So yeah, I think if I was to summarize where you are seeing this balance change is when the economic costs of your geopolitical adventurism maybe become too high. When the economic costs start to become too high, you'll probably see the balance shift back. I mean, I'm a big believer that ultimately economics drives everything else. Economic power drives everything else, and for the common people, it's their economic livelihood that matters most at the very end. And what I'm hearing you say is that as the economic costs pile up, whether it's in Korea, whether it's in other parts of Asia or Europe, those countries will also start to then emphasize to the US that listen, there's a limit here to how far you can get this geopolitical game go. The other piece of this global economic order I want to talk to you about is the governance institutions, right? And then we'll get into the technology piece, which I'm ready to get into. But the global economic governance institutions, as we've known them for the last few decades, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, then the WTO instead of institutions, and maybe the G7 and others. This architecture that's been around for a while, do you expect this to now change given the kind of dynamics we've been talking about? And if so, what does that global economic governance set of institutions or frameworks look like? More bilateral, more regional, more global? What's your outlook on that?
No, I think you're right to raise it. I think all the global institutions are being forced into more restricted roles, less support, less fairness. And so the question is, how do we manage that? What happens to them? But there's no question the change is underway. And part of that is fundamental geopolitics, as I think you see it. We had a joint conference with the IMF Research Department a month or so ago at Peterson, and the first speaker on the first day was Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister. But I mean, importantly, he had been a visionary chair of the IMFC, the committee that basically runs the IMF and the World Bank. And he said part of the issue is we've moved from a unipolar to a multipolar world, and the institutions haven't adapted. So, I mean, that's right, in my view. The WTO is getting a lot of stick because in the US it's become a whipping boy, the same way UNESCO or the UN more broadly was a whipping boy in previous decades. Whipping boy is a terrible expression, but I mean it in this case. It's just being used to be struck at. And as Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General, said in the speech at Peterson last month, this is totally unrepresentative of what the vast majority of WTO members get, which is something good. And there's a lot of dispute settlement, a lot of positive things going on without the U.S. But we've had USTR, Lighthizer under Trump, and now Ty under Biden, who just fundamentally don't want the U.S. to be subject to any sort of international standard or adjudication. And it's similar to things on the International Criminal Court and and on environment, where the U.S. wants to insist that our subsidies are equivalent to other countries' carbon prices. The U.S. just repeatedly wants to be an exception. And I wrote an article several years ago called "The Post-American Global Economy." Came out in Foreign Affairs, talking about the idea that the U.S. had been chair of the club. The club was not a perfect rules-based organization, but the U.S. did get certain benefits, including some self-dealing as a result of the club. But it was as a result of being chair of the club, But on balance, from the late 40s till arguably the early 2000s, maybe as late as the Obama first term, the U.S. behaved okay as chair of the club, enough to make it worth others to stick in, and the U.S. realized that. And at some point, I think starting before Trump, starting definitely by Obama's second term, but obviously made worse by Trump and continued, and despite alternative rhetoric from Biden, that's just continued. The U.S. basically has said, if we're, I made the analogy in a different piece, it's going from being commissioner of baseball to being owner of one of the teams. And and if you're owner of one of the teams, everybody benefits when you lose, as opposed to you benefit from the game as a whole. And as a result, we end up with a weak commissioner or no commissioner. And so the league as a whole gets worse. And eventually the U.S. has nobody to play with. And even if they're the Yankees or the Kansas City Chiefs or whatever, or Man City or whatever sports analogy you want to make,
Yeah.
if you end up having nobody wants to play with you because you cheat, it's not any good to be the strongest team.
It's almost like
So anyway,
what the US tells the Chinese, that play by the
yeah,
rules. Like, we want a rules-based
yeah,
order.
yeah.
The Chinese want to be their own
Yeah, oh yeah,
there
absolutely.
also.
None of this is about excusing the Chinese
Yeah,
Communist
yeah.
Party's behavior in these ways. I mean, what they're doing on international lending, outside of normal sovereign lending standards, without transparency, and not participating in various fora to reduce the debt burden on other developing countries, I mean, is shameful. What they've done to the Uyghurs in human rights terms is shameful. Nonetheless, you could have a
Yeah.
world in which everybody but China, or everybody but China, North Korea, and a couple others, were basically working within a decent system. And on average, people complied with the rules. And on average, the U.S. would not be held to the rules very often or would win. But there was enough rules-based behavior from the U.S. that it was worth it to everybody else.
For
And this
everyone
was,
else
of
to
course,
keep playing the game. So,
yeah,
so again, I think in some ways you've told me what it should be like. That hopefully the US will revert to more reasonable behavior and as commissioner as opposed to a team owner. But is your sense that that'll happen now? Do you see signs there's a growing realization that that behavior or that sort of strategy needs to change?
I think it's issue area by issue area, but unfortunately, I think it's getting worse for the short term. Um, so for example, I think on some technical environmental issues, I think on some international development issues with the World Bank, the U.S. is not at all being generous or doing its fair share of funding, but it's at least behaving okay. I think on AI, where there's some discussions, including with China, there's some potential for constructive behavior, but these are the exception. I think the WTO, the IMF, the currency regime that exists, I think, is going to be under threat in the next administration. I think I think it's eroding in a lot of places.
And so, what implications does this have for the institutional framework? Do you expect the China plus friends and dependents, do they start to form their own set of institutions as there's a fear
No,
that
I mean, I think you'll get institutions for show. So, like, in the District of Columbia in Washington, we have a University of District of Columbia because every state has a university. But that doesn't mean that it's, unfortunately, on a par or used the same way University of Michigan or University of California or University of Wisconsin is. Similarly, so China creates the AIIB, or they create the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or there's a new BRICS Bank, or they'll create a web of swap lines akin to what the Fed has for friendly countries that get financial arrangement trouble in currency crises. But none of these will be institutions worth the name in the same way, because they will be, even more than the U.S. absent or the U.S. abused institutions, subject to China as chair, self-dealing, overruling the rules. AIB so far has tried hard not to do that, but I don't expect it to last. and therefore the membership will not be all that attractive, or at least lasting membership. So you can imagine a country gets into trouble, and if the U.S. isn't sufficiently generous, or things are deadlocked at the IMF or the World Bank or something, if China reaches out with a bilateral loan, that country may sign up for our various Chinese-led institutions. But they may find, as a number of countries have, Chinese lending comes with a lot more strings, Chinese sovereign lending, comes with a lot more strings and abuse than, for all the complaining, Western or Japanese or even Indian lending does. So I don't think it's you get substitute institutions. I think you get partial substitutes. I think the question is how much the so-called third nations, meaning basically everybody except China and US, manage to keep the rest of the system going. And I think it varies from institution to institution. What are the prospects? So I have coming out in a couple of weeks a new article in which I call for the IMF to become more like an independent central bank and have the US and China and Europe basically all agree to back off and let the IMF be more independent in its operations in return for a narrow remit and knowing that China or US isn't going to mess with the place. But I don't think that would work for WTO. I think for WTO, it's something very different. I think what Ngozi and others have been pushing, I think is right. You have to somehow create a plurilateral rather than a multilateral WTO. That you have essentially a WTO that functions for its members without the US and without China if necessary, even if you don't literally kick them out.
Yeah, yeah. Let's now move to the technology piece, right? Shift gears and move to the technology piece. So now, I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier, it was, I think, item number 4 of your 4 broad themes, technology as the driver of productivity, which obviously, as most economists know, is the key to driving economic growth. And at the center, as I see it, of the U.S. China battle, even though geopolitics seems to be the dimension that both of these countries seem to be focusing more on, ultimately it's economic leadership that matters, right? So both countries are going to have to do their best, as do others, the middle powers or the other powers we've been talking about, and Europe, to grow fast, to drive economic growth, right? So now, in the world of technology, which I've inhabited for the last, over a decade or so, time and time again, there's a new wave of technology that comes in. The consumer internet came in, drove the creation of the Googles and the Facebooks and Amazons of the world. Now the new thing is AI, right? Seemingly artificial intelligence. So now I want to ask you, one, tell us, do you truly, and this is an argument I made in my book, but I want to get your critique on it. I said that today technology is driving the economic destinies of nations. Like in the industrial era back in the day, or the last 200, 300 years, countries that got their industrial strategy right, countries that built key niches in the industrial value chain globally, countries that moved quickly on that front, won, and are still benefiting or reaping the benefits. Similarly, today, it's technologies that are driving the economic destinies of nations, countries that are getting their tech strategy right, that are building the right tech ecosystems, that are building great companies, that are doing great tech R&D, building core IP, building global companies basis that, they are the ones who are going to be the new winners in what I've called the great tech game in my book. Is that overstated? Is my emphasis on technology as the key driver overstated? Or would you agree with it?
Your book is deservedly influential, and your title, which is also, of course, the title of the podcast, The Great Tech Game, is apt. I think the emphasis on technology is right. The place where genuinely I have a difference with you is twofold. First, going back to what you were just saying about the international institutions, which I know you're aware of, obviously, is how much the national pursuit of these local tech advantages has foreign and economic blowback from other sources. And I read your book. I like your book, but I think you don't choose to include enough of that, in my view.
You mean the drawbacks of techno nationalism, so to say?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And so you say it as though each country can do this, but there are disadvantages that if it's like arms races, not everything is productive competition. Sometimes it's just you run in place to end up in the same place, and there's also issues on both sides of the coin. On there may be advantages to in global scale in terms of standardization, in terms of economies of scale. Again, on particular technologies, not on everything in general. But then the flip side is it may be that if it's incumbent countries, basically China and the US, grab everything, it may be that the Indias, the UKs, the Japans, whoever, the Brazils can't get in. And so, how does one navigate that? The second place where I'm a little different place than you, and again, I'm not sure we believe differently, but in terms of what I remember you included and didn't include, is that you put a very big emphasis on technological development and production, which is justified. I don't feel like you put enough, and you talk about tech ecosystems and all that. I don't feel you put enough emphasis on adoption and and spread.
and diffusion. Yeah,
In diffusion is the right term. See, I mean, I'm a macroeconomist. I'm not a tech person, as you and I talked about before I came on the program. I learned from people like you on tech issues. So diffusion is the right word.
yeah,
But I think that's a critical issue, and no more so than in climate. And so
absolutely.
we end up going down this great tech game, as you call it, and we end up dividing the world in terms of who's got solar, who doesn't, who's got cheap EVs, who doesn't, who's fitting what standard. Are you with me? Are you against me? If you're with me, you're going to buy US or Chinese or German standard of certain tech things and not. And frankly, even more than usual, the people in the north and in the nice latitudes in the north still have a huge interest in getting the better technologies diffused across the developing world because it directly affects climate change. I mean, beyond the human
Absolutely.
decency and beyond the economic
Absolutely. Yeah.
trade opportunities, diffusion. But a lot of not what you advocate, but what others running with the insights you and others have made end up doing is working against tech diffusion. It's all about has to be produced in the U.S. It has to fit a U.S. standard. You only get it once we've done it. I mean, I look at what happened with vaccines. Again, I know you're well aware of this, but for your listeners, look at what happened with vaccines. I mean, so China and Russia had God knows how many unnecessary deaths because they were insistent that they would not use an American owned based vaccine.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I think I completely agree with you actually on the diffusion and adoption piece. I think ultimately tech diffusion and adoption, much like we talk about in the context of trade, right? Once you have open trade, there's lots of benefits that accrue, whereas protectionism or nationalism in trade often will deprive your citizens of lots of benefits in many different ways and angles. Similarly, with tech, I think if you prevent adoption and diffusion, you're denying, right? I mean, you don't want to go into that place where accessing a mobile phone, for example, a smartphone is so expensive that you can't have your entire population benefit from it. Similarly, tomorrow with AI, etc. I think the nuance I try to put is that each country will have to figure out its own strategy. Of course, for a country like India, for example, adoption and diffusion is, from a socio-economic political imperative, massively important. You've got to get technology into the hands of small businesses, individuals, everywhere. And you don't want to like slow down that adoption and diffusion. At the same time, to go to the next level of economic growth, I argue that you've got to get into the development piece. And right, but if you don't make that jump at some point, it's almost like the value add ladder. You can't continue to just be at the lower end of the value add ladder. At some point, you've got to go over and start doing some of that value added work. Otherwise, of course, you are always a consumer of technology, which means the massive profits that today, let's say, big tech firms in the US derive from their development of technology, you'll never see anything like that, right?
Yes and no. I mean, I basically agree that there has to be movement up the ladder. There has to be the possibility, and that's part of what I was trying to get to when saying there are these foreign overseas blowbacks and problems. You're too focused on
Everyone has to
domestic
see that opportunity
production.
for mobility in a way, upward
Yes,
mobility.
exactly. If you don't have that opportunity, not just in ethical but in practical terms, it's terrible. But the place I want to push back a bit is I think there's still more gains to be had by the adoption and use of these technologies than by the production. So when we look, yes, Meta or Amazon or Alphabet or whatever they're all calling themselves now get outsized profits. But nonetheless, they're still small compared to if there was able to be AI usage, say, in 5 years' time. Say India becomes the world exporter of services because AI allows a lot of, even more than we've already seen, remote processing and remote use of skilled people. You know, that's just one example. And so I think what you're saying is valid, but I think if we look at the U.S. growth in the late 90s, for example, in the early 2000s, you know, the actual share of economic growth that was due to chips production, fiber optic cable, computer production, even software was not very large. What was the gains was Walmart and McDonald's and Bank of America and whoever adopted and used the diffused technology. And so I just don't want to lose that part of the story.
Yeah, no, fair enough, fair enough. So now let's talk about your view on this, the productivity gains you expect from generative AI in particular. I know you've written a little bit about this. Is it overhyped first? Like, let me get your sort of headline view on that. Do you think Gen AI and its impact on like across the sector as a general purpose technology overhyped the way people are comparing it to electricity and the steam engine and things like that? And second, how do you feel like how quickly do you think the gains from productivity from Gen AI are likely to show up in economic metrics?
So again, thank you for asking. And as we discussed again, disclaimer, I'm not a technology person. I'm a macro former central banker forecaster. So I look at this as a macro person. So if I look through history, the last 150 years, 200 years, when there were these general purpose technology jumps, so railroads, internal combustion engine, transistor, air conditioning, internet, you know, pick your list. Generally, you would see, or very high probability, you would see a couple things happen before the productivity gains were felt. First would be you'd see something that looks like what economists call labor hoarding, that people start adding staff or retaining staff. I shouldn't say people, businesses start adding staff and retaining staff more than what the current economic growth outlook would justify normally. And the idea is that they know something's in the wind and they want to be prepared to take advantage of it. Similarly, what you see is what I'll call probably misnomer crowding in of investment, private sector investment into certain tech fields. So like we're seeing now with generative AI. You get, it's not just massive, which of course it is, but that nobody knows who's going to win. Everybody knows the technology is coming, but nobody knows whether it's going to be one of the incumbents, some new firm that gets acquired by one of the incumbents. We don't know. So everybody becomes a VC and is basically trying to find the unicorn. And we saw this with railroads, for example, in the late 19th century, or with automobile production. There were actually many, many companies because everybody knew they wanted to be part of it, but nobody knew who was going to be the company that ended. And that's in contrast to the last 20 years plus, where we had a series of technological advances, but you didn't see that kind of investment gold rush. So what I'm seeing in the data now, in terms of both labor and in tech investment, looks to me like the run up to a major productivity boom. Now, again, these are necessary but not sufficient conditions, meaning pretty much you have to see these if there's going to be a tech boom, but just because you see these doesn't mean there's going to be a tech boom. Right. So I combine these observations with reading people like you and people you have in your program who are telling me all the great things Gen AI is going to do. And then I say, okay, so the combination of this credible case that the tech is for real with what I'm seeing in the economy makes me believe it. The harder question for me, I mean, I'm still be wrong, but anyway, but the harder question for me where I don't know, I don't have a great guess, is the time period. How long it takes before you start seeing it as affecting the macro data. There's almost no question that the productivity gains we saw at a higher rate in 2023 were not driven by generative AI. There just hasn't been enough adoption yet.
Yet, yeah.
So then, there are good economists out there doing studies where they look at how long it took new technologies to get adopted through various measures. And, in the past, there were periods that took 20, 30 years for a technology to mature. There's a decent prima facie case it'll be very different for generative AI because the upfront costs beyond energy usage are not that high. There isn't a lot of capital investment, maybe for the producers, but not for the users. And that by its nature, it's not that hard to train people up and use it. But you still have to transform business practices, which takes time.
Yeah. The timing, of course, will be driven by, I think, as what you're trying to say is by the pace of adoption and diffusion of AI. The faster you see the adoption and diffusion, you expect that productivity gain to show up in economies that are the fastest adopting ones. We'll see
Right.
it quickly.
And which leads to the third question to go with your first two, which is this for real and how fast, is where does it get picked up? And so that again is an adoption diffusion question. And we've seen through the years that some economies are better at picking stuff up than not. And again, you can make a case that for a lot of poorer economies, just as there was leapfrogging with cell phones, this could leapfrog and it won't be that hard, that difficult for some poorer economies to adopt this. On the other hand, you have things like in Europe, which for good political and historical reasons is very concerned about data privacy and security and disruption of job loss. And so they may end up slowing the adoption of AI as a result in Europe. So the IMF had a paper that they produced before Davos in January. The research department, Pierre Levy Grinchas and his team put it out, trying to address some of this, looking at different countries' ability and proclivity to adopt AI. I think it's fine as far as it goes, but of course they have to be careful about not saying nasty things about their members. So I think it ends up being a little bit too general.
Fair enough. Let's now move into. I know we've been going deep into the first two pieces. I want to move into the country specific questions that I have for you. We've spoken a fair length about the U.S. There's one question I want to ask you about the U.S., which you referred to, and then we'll get into the China. And I know you've written some great, interesting pieces around China and the Chinese economy and foreign affairs recently, which I want to get into. But on the U.S., you mentioned earlier in our conversation today that there's this overemphasis on manufacturing. As the economic strategy of the U.S. evolves to compete with China in this new global economic order that we are seeing emerge or might see emerge, you mentioned that there's an overemphasis on manufacturing. Why do you say that? And what's the alternative?
I say it for two big reasons. I mean, the first is just the facts of this matter, which is right now manufacturing is roughly 13% of total U.S. employment, and a lot of that is overstated because some of that's managerial and services, not truly manufacturing. And value added is significantly higher, which is just another way of saying because of technology, we don't need as many people to manufacture things. And so thinking about this as a transformative jobs program for millions of Americans who have less formal education to somehow get long-term high-paying jobs is just completely unrealistic. And the Biden administration, at least in some audiences and by some officials, has been more honest about this and saying they shouldn't overpromise. So the first point is just simple facts. no matter what you think is going to happen with manufacturing, it's not going to be this enormous jobs engine, full stop. My colleague at Peterson, Robert Lawrence, has a book coming out, I believe, this fall, addressing head-on this issue of can manufacturing, either in the U.S. or in developing countries, become the engine of growth it once was for jobs? And the answer is basically no. It can be helpful, but it can't be the.
It's not the full answer, correct? Yeah.
It's not the full answer. The second argument why I think manufacturing is overemphasized is the political aspect. I think it distorts our discourse. I think it, going back to something we were talking about a couple sections ago about the place-based economic policies, and particularly in the U.S., and this rhetoric about heartland and yeah, and if you read Robert Lighthizer book, which is thought to be a blueprint of sorts, or at least a mission statement for a second Trump administration on economic issues, he makes a lot about people are happy when they're productive, and it's good for people to be productive. And some people would say they trace this back to a Catholic social tradition in the U.S. of giving people value. But I think in the end, it ends up being something which essentially devalues services. It devalues people who aren't macho moving large objects and heavy machinery. And therefore, inherently, and partly, I think intentionally, it's sexist and racist, because it's really about certain images that these people really like. And again, there are people in the Biden administration and Democratic Party who have the same thing. It's really important we have cars and American-made cars, and we see people driving big cars, and we have people making cars. And cars are good. Cars are nice. I don't think they're necessarily that much gooder or nicer than teachers or hospital workers or pseudo academics like us. And I think politically, even if it's not always intended this way, the rallying around manufacturing tends to feed into a reactionary nationalist narrative.
Yeah,
I think it's destructive.
Yeah, it's even in a country like India, right, which traditionally has not been a massive manufacturing base, right? Unlike, let's say, China or some of the East Asian tigers, so to say. There's a massive sort of debate between manufacturing as a source of jobs versus services. India is largely a services nation, and therefore a lot of economists also argue that India must build on its services strengths, large English speaking population, decently educated, tech savvy, build on that services strategy and become an even bigger services nation. Globalization seems to be moving away from trading of goods to trading of services, so that'll be an advantage. And then that's why I'm so surprised by the US talking so much about manufacturing. And in some ways, it takes me back to one of the points I make in my book, that somehow politicians obviously also are very used to playing a previous game and are not looking out to build capabilities for the coming game that they have to play or compete in, right? Is your sense that that's what's going on also in the US? There's a little bit of this framework from the past that people are continuing to rely on, that jobs are good, manufacturing is good.
I think there's some of that, as you're well aware and have spoken about, Ani, that there's a long-standing, very serious development debate in India around this question of services versus manufacturing.
Yeah.
My Peterson colleague, Arvind Subramanian, has done some writing about this as well, about what's possible given the deglobalization of the rich countries not necessarily allowing in the same amount of imports. And so there's that. But I do think it's related in the U.S., but it is a little different. I think basically services get undervalued in the U.S. in the discourse, partly for political science reasons, that they tend to be less localized and less visible than plant or manufacturing, so politicians can't claim credit in the same way. Partly because services tend to get allocated to one of two buckets mentally by a lot of people. It's either a Mick job, a bad McDonald's fast food flipping job, which actually aren't necessarily all that bad, many of which lead to other things, including management roles. But anyway, or they're parasitical elitists, academic scribblers, white collars like me, who are suspect and bad anyway. Um, it's odd considering that roughly 80% to 85% of US workers are in services in some sense, that's the way it's perceived. And then, of course, you've also got the gendered association that a lot of services are seen as female in some way and therefore or lower class in some way, and that gets part of it. So I mean, these are things. I'm not a cultural critic, I'm not a politician, I shouldn't talk about these things, but just basically
That's the
that's part of the context, I think, for the discussion.
yeah. Let's move to China, right? We haven't spoken enough about it yet. You've written about the Chinese economy. Has it peaked?
I think the growth rate's definitely peaked. Has the economy as a whole peaked, either in the sense of being a tech leader or its relative size versus the rest of the world? No. I think though the relative size versus the rest of the world, we're getting close to peak. Partly that's just reality, demographics, much lower population growth, but also getting closer to the technological frontier. So in the US, as you said, in great tech game, I mean, right, we have these leading companies, and China may end up, already has some companies that, despite US saying we don't want to play anymore, may end up having leading roles in much of the world. But just as in the US, that still only gets you a growth rate of 2.5% when you're doing well on average. It's not going to save the Chinese economy from a slowdown in its growth rate. So in that sense, peaked, yeah, probably. In the sense that peaked, it's going into decline, or it's not going to be able to compete in tech in certain sectors, or that it's not going to be a player. No, that's premature. I think China's still around for that purpose for the next 10 to 50 years.
And one of the other pieces that you mentioned, the foreign affairs article that you wrote, was that a lot of this, the struggles that the Chinese economy seems to be facing, are the doing of Xi Jinping's strategies, policies. Michael Pettis says there are structural reasons at play. The inability of the Chinese economy to move from a high investment type economy to a more consumption-led economy. Structural reasons like that are what's slowing down. I know you guys had a counter debate on it. What's your thinking now on that? The structural reasons, or still more Xi
I
Jinping?
think the structural arguments don't fit the facts.
Don't fit the
Period.
facts.
So as no, period. I mean, no matter how much your friends and others say it, it's still false. Let me finish the sentence. As my colleague Nicholas Lardy, or as Barry Naughton at the University of California, or as other Chinese scholars have established, you have a massive growth in private versus public investment in China. Over a multi-decade period, the private investment continues to have rising returns, and the share of consumption in China was less quickly than optimal, but was rising and was increasing, and the current account surplus with the world as a whole, as opposed to U.S. bilateral, had gone down. So this was a long-term trend, all of which basically contradicts what those people say, the so-called structural aspect. And so growth was improving and continuing to improve, and reallocation was underway. Starting roughly around 2015, Xi comes in. The share of investment going to private sector peaks shortly thereafter. The current account deficits start going up shortly thereafter. The savings behavior of Chinese household investment changes during COVID, as I point out. So the facts do not fit the so-called structuralist point of view.
Yeah, and so I think great debate. Now let's assume that
It's not a debate. They're wrong and I'm
they're
right.
wrong. Let's say you're right. Now, I want to go with that assumption that you're right. Are you seeing signs that Xi Jinping and the strategies that he's so far, the policies him and his government have so far propagated, right? Let's say since 2015, that you're finding fault in, right? That's what's causing their economic trouble. Are you seeing signs of them realizing that and changing it? That's the question I'm more interested in. Are they seeing what you are seeing is wrong and then trying to make course corrections here?
I think the answer is no, because partly they're not seeing it, and partly because they have different goals. So again, it goes back to what you and I were saying in the U.S. context and other contexts. You can decide as politicians that, in this case, not legitimate, not elected, but anyway, politicians,
Nevertheless, correct.
right, that national security in some definition or resilience in some definition is more important than economic efficiency. And I got to meet with Wang Qishan well pre-COVID, who was Xi's ideological advisor just outside the Politburo, and he was very open, and this was very public. There was a deliberate change that they felt there had been too much marketization. The party had been weakened. The spirit of the Chinese people had been weakened. There was too much welfarism. I don't know the Chinese term, but it's translated as welfarism. And so on, and this was leading to too much individualism and problems, including corruption. And so you can decide, as the leader of China, those things are more important to me than economic growth, and so part of it is this is suiting his purposes, and if Xi's goals and the people around Xi's goals. And so there's a lot of talk about, again, I don't speak Chinese, but I read people who translate and analyze this, about having to eat bitterness and young people having to be tough, and even some positive invocations of Cultural Revolution period, which is insane. But anyway, the idea that we need people to be tougher, more self-reliant. China needs to be more self-reliant. We need more savings and less consumption. We need less self-indulgence. So part of the reason they're not changing is because they like some of the changes. They may not be economically helpful, but they suit other goals. Secondly, among the more technocratic people, who Xi has not completely replaced, throughout the government, there was a legitimate concern that, as we've seen with the real estate sector, that there was too much financial speculation going on. And that if they didn't reassert control in the financial sector, in the real estate sector, in various ways, or if they're too stimulative with policies, even just general fiscal policies or monetary policies, they will reinflate bubbles, they will cause financial instability. And she specifically endorsed that as a priority to avoid that. And so I think those two factors, the first one I understand, and it's just that's their priorities. And the second one I understand and partially endorse, lead to a China set of policies right now that is for slower growth. And again, I'm not going to say that's their right because it's not a legitimate government. Who knows? But that's the decision.
That's the
It's a
path.
consistent story.
Yeah, which brings me to the middle powers and emerging powers. I know you're not, I mean, the Indian economy is not something that I know you studied maybe as deeply as the Chinese one. But tell me, where do you see the outlook for a country like India? And maybe you can also discuss a little bit on some of the other countries we mentioned earlier, like the Mexicos and Indonesias and Brazils of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I do believe India first and foremost, but those 4 or 5 countries we mentioned, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, arguably Poland, arguably Turkey, a few others, but basically those 4 or 5 are going to have a lot more room to pursue their own economic destiny and a lot more effect on others in this world where China and the US are in conflict. Now, that's not pursue their economic destiny is a great phrase, but it's not the same as necessarily the best benefit for people. Because as you were raising and we were saying a few minutes ago, ideally there's a ladder where India started off producing certain things and then works its way up, and then Nepal and Pakistan are somewhere down here, or in Bangladesh, and they're working their way up. And if we have all this geopolitical conflict and nationalism among the big economic powers, the possibility for them to work their way up may be more limited. But in terms of room for play for the governments and importance on their effect on the global scene, I think India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico are just at the start of a secular uptrend. And some of this we've already seen. I mean, and the causes we can go into, but I think it's very striking that we've just had a couple of years where there was major inflation in the US, and not major, but meaningful inflation in the US, and a very rapid rise in interest rates. And India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia all managed that while still controlling their own macro policies, very little financial instability or spillovers on them, relatively solid currencies, no big outflows. And you look back at the preceding 40, 50 years, it's very hard to find a Fed cycle of even much less steep tightening where you didn't have capital outflows, financial problems, lack of ability to offset with your macro policies. So I think India, Brazil, and others are already showing some of that greater autonomy and resilience on the macro side than they used to have. So I view this as important. And then relating it back to the geopolitics, and of course, India is more central than anybody else in this in some ways. I think what my colleague at the LKY school in Singapore, Danny Kwa, has talked about as the third nations is incredibly important in geopolitical terms. So we talked earlier about the institutions. Do India and Brazil, for example, which were seen as very obstructionist to the WTO recurrently and undependable back and forth on the IMF, do they choose to exert more control in a constructive way and keep these institutions going if the US and China are being irresponsible? Do they create or pitch in, BRICS Bank, things like that, or the whole BRICS concept? India may choose to put a lot of effort in that. I think it's understandable why they want to do it, and looking at it as sort of an optionality, showing they're on decent terms with China and have some alternatives to the US, I think is reasonable. Putting real hopes into any of the BRICS initiatives turning into something useful for India beyond that, I'm very skeptical. But there's a lot more room for play
for these countries. Yeah.
And again, without pretending to expertise on India, obviously, because of its size, because of its demographic profile, because of its military and foreign policy role, notwithstanding a lot of internal domestic issues, India and its skill base, India, has a potential to play beyond what even Indonesia and Brazil have. And Mexico, unfortunately, even though I think they've played their hand very well the last few years, I worry is very vulnerable to nationalism, economic nationalism from the US. So, we just had last week the announcement of this whole new set of tariffs, mainly on EVs, but also steel and other things from China. China has been investing, as have others, in Mexico as a platform for diversification of supply chains to get into U.S. markets. The Biden administration and the Trump campaign have been very clear that they actually don't like the idea that there should be production of Chinese cars and batteries in Mexico that comes to the U.S. And if they impede that, they're not only violating letter and spirit of USMCA, of what used to be NAFTA, they're doing harm to Mexico. They're basically saying to Mexico, just because you can't even become our near shore, you can't even become our friend shore, you can't get investment from it. Now, again, if it's just China and the Japanese and the German and the Korean investment and the US investment in Mexico pays off, it's not so bad. If the US makes up for it with some other policies, it's not so bad. But I fear Mexico, as usual, will not be as well treated by the U.S. as the U.S. should in its own enlightened self-interest.
Yeah. No, this has been great. I've taken up a lot of your time. Thanks for being generous with your time. We've covered lots of topics, macro to, I think, in the last 10, 15 minutes, more micro with certain countries. We end every podcast, Adam, with two quick questions. One, for our listeners, a book that you recommend for people, listeners interested in the kinds of issues we've been discussing, the span of issues we've been discussing, a book, and you can name more than one that you recommend. And second is a podcast guest that you recommend.
All right. Books, I would recommend two. One I mentioned, which is 30 years old, is the first of Paul Krugman's popular books called The Age of Diminished Expectations, because it reminds you about this issue of how people are slow to reset what's feasible in their heads and what they want from policy and politics versus what may be attainable. The second, I'm going to be boring. Like everybody else, I learned a huge amount from Chip Wars, the big book of last year, and I just genuinely learned a lot. And so, if somebody hasn't read it, I would suggest they read it.
And what
In
about
terms
Chinese economics? Any
of,
particular reader, writer, author, thinker that you?
I mean, I'll be partisan. My colleague Nicholas Lardy did a pair of books some years ago. First called "Markets Over Mao," and second, "The State Strikes Back," which was about the two factual developments I talked about in China. But also, I think there was a very good New Yorker article by Evan Osnos about 6 months ago, is sort of looking similar in spirit to what I was saying about the economy, but more broadly about China. And I'm hoping, as he's done in the past, he'll turn that
Into a book. No, good. I like this. The first time I think we've got a recommendation for a book that's not yet been written, or at least hasn't come out. What about a podcast guest or two that you would recommend?
I would strongly recommend, if you haven't had him already, Robert Zoellick, the former World Bank president, former USTR, a non-Trump Republican who is very much committed to free trade and the world order. I would also recommend my younger colleague, Yeling Tan, who's a political scientist at Oxford's Blavatsky School, and affiliated with the Peterson Institute. She's very interesting on Chinese political economy and moving into these economic security issues. And she would be a very different perspective.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Adam. This has been a fascinating almost hour and a half. Thanks for sparing the time, and I hope that travels or work hopefully brings you to India as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me, including me in your star-studded roster, Ari.
No, you're too kind. Thank you so much, Adam.